Many of you asked for it, so here it is. I received tons of requests both on my Hungarian and English channels about the good old Railgun. However, there was no consensus on whether the Quake 2 or Quake 3 design should be the winner. For some strange reason, nobody mentioned the Railgun from Quake 4. You also suggested a lot of railguns, so I thought this would make a great thematic series. In this episode, let's dive into the world of Quake 3. In my previous video where I talked about how iconic the rocket launcher is in the FPS genre, many of you pointed out that the railgun was much more memorable in Quake 3. I can't argue with that opinion. Sci-fi hitscan weapons have always been close to my heart. But what is hitscan? When we talk about FPS firearms, we typically distinguish between hitscan and projectile weapons. Projectile weapons work by launching a projectile at a certain speed, which sometimes follows a curved path influenced by gravity. A good example is the rocket launcher. You can calculate the projectile's impact timing if you are familiar with the weapon's behavior. In contrast, hitscan weapons hit the target the moment you fire, as if the bullet travels at infinite speed. Just like our beloved railgun. However, it's worth mentioning that hitscan mechanics aren't exclusive to sci-fi beam weapons. Take a look at good old Counter-Strike. Even though you're fighting with realistic guns, bullet speed isn't a factor. Every shot hits instantly and preferably deals damage. Still, my favorite hitscan examples will always include Quake's Railgun and Unreal Tournament's ASMD shock rifle. I happily dive into an instagame deathmatch every now and then. Let's talk a bit about railguns. The general concept is to accelerate the projectile to an extremely high velocity, where the massive damage comes not from an explosive warhead, but purely from kinetic energy. But that's how regular firearms work too, you might say. And you'd be right. But while traditional firearms rely on chemical propulsion, essentially a controlled explosion, the railgun achieves this using magnetic forces, solely by investing electric energy into the system. In real life, these are still massive energy-hungry stationary weapons, but it's fun to imagine what a handheld version might be like. Here it's worth mentioning the coil gun, a kind of little sibling to the railgun. While it has lower projectile speeds, it can be built in handheld form. It uses a chain of electromagnetic coils to accelerate the projectile within a magnetic field. But enough physics. In the lore of Quake, the problem of miniaturizing the railgun is already solved. We just get to enjoy the results. Or we would, if we didn't have to build it first. Let's get to it. Like every of my builds, this one starts with modeling. I always try to follow my own principles when creating replicas. It should resemble the original as closely as possible. It should feel good to hold and be roughly proportionate. Game designers often don't care about this. If the original model is too plain or low poly, I add some small details to make it look more realistic without straying from the original design. I like adding interactive elements that make the model more than just a static prop. That means I have to make room inside for the electronics. This model was printed with minimal redesign and minimal waste. I already loved holding the raw version, but it wasn't ready for the shelf yet. As always, after printing, the main task was priming and sanding. It's a dirty job, but absolutely essential. Any flaws you leave at this stage will be visible on the finished weapon, and you won't get a second chance to fix them. In this case, after the first coat of paint, I had to resand the whole thing because a bunch of tiny imperfections showed up that weren't visible before. Once I finally had a perfectly smooth metallic looking surface, it was time to apply the first paint layer. Previously I'd always painted the base color first and added metallic chipping on the top. This time I tried a new method, hoping it would work. The gun is brown, but its metallic base shows through in many places, so first I painted the entire gun in zinc color and then layered the brown on top. After some masking, I added the dark brown coat. The advantage of painting brown over the metal layer is that I can scrape it to reveal the metallic base underneath. At this stage, the dark brown looked flat, so I needed some highlights and dirt. The original plan was to add several layers of brown and then damage the paint, but definitely not because of my impatience. That plan changed. I added a lighter brown layer next to bring out the shapes and add highlights. Of course, this meant another round of paint scraping, but the result already looked much better. I should also mention that the front section of the gun is separate from the body and it's entirely metallic. I used a shinier steel paint here to create a nice contrast with the rest. If you don't overdo it, varying textures and surfaces can really enhance realism. As much realism as we can talk about for a railgun anyway. The grip and shoulder stock were simpler. I painted them black and added lighter weathering and hand painted the edges, scratches and paint chipping. This section becomes important later when we install the electronics. I did the same for the other accessory and decorative elements. The first task was setting up the lighting, which I approached in several steps. First, I wrote a super simple script to light everything up in a single color. Second, I created an animation. My initial idea was to make the lights pulse slowly to make it look more like a functional weapon. Then I realized that in the game, a running light moved backwards in waves, so I scrapped the original code and started fresh. Until now, I tested everything on a single small LED strip, but for this new animation, I needed the final setup. Timing was crucial, so the lights would float smoothly along the gun's entire length. I reused an old trick of mine. I designed the 3D model with a standard PVC pipe running through the center. This makes it easy to route the wires and attach the LED strips securely. Satisfied with the look, I moved on to interactivity. I wasn't sure at first whether the light should be green or white. Then I realized that Quake Live slightly changed the gun's appearance. In the original 99 version, the light was white and turned purple when you fired. But in Quake Live, the gun had green lights and darkened when firing. I will use the classic design by default, but if I have time, I will make it switchable between the two. I also added an audio board that plays sound effects when you fire.
Impressive.
The speaker was salvaged from an old laptop, and I made space for it on the back of the gun. Time to assemble the weapon. First I finalized the electronics inside the grip section. This houses the microcontroller, the audio board and all the buttons. The battery bank goes into the main body and connects to the rest of the electronics when the two main parts are assembled. I also added a charging port just in case the gun runs out of juice. Next came the white panels that diffuse the light. In the game there's a cool texture visible through the running lights, so I didn't want to leave that out. By this point, the side panels and the gun's front section were already attached, so it was time for final assembly. After soldering the wires, I installed the bottom cover plate and the gun took its final shape. Well, almost final. I still planned one last round of weathering to unify the look. A black and brown wash brought the tones together and gave the gun its final gritty look. Once the weapon was complete, I pushed myself to code the Quake Live color scheme and added adjustable brightness too. Let's check out the final result. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I recommend you to check my other builds. I always welcome comments and suggestions for future projects. This video came about that way too. If you'd like to support my future builds, you can buy me a coffee or join my Patreon, where I also be sharing bonus content about ongoing projects.